Give it one, two, three, and it's going. All right.
Awesome.
So, to start us off with a round of introductions, could you perhaps say a little bit about what your current role or job title is and what that means?
Yes, my current job title is education consultant. I'm a self-employed consultant, mostly working in higher education between Canada and the UK. And I help people with policy work, process work, and kind of my area of expertise is open education and educational technology. So I also deal with edtech projects as well. But I do other things as well. I work for an organization called the Open ETC. I've been doing that since 2018. That's a shared platform of open educational technologies for the whole of British Columbia. I've been on the Government of British Columbia's Digital Advisory Committee since 2021, and I've got quite a long history in open source ed tech in education as well. And I used to be board chair of the Apereo Foundation, and I currently sit on the board of the Open Source Initiative. So there's things I do for money and there's things I do for love. But they're all in that open ed tech and the kind of policy stuff around all of that. So
Sounds
there you
good.
go.
Awesome. So, as our conversation will be about OpenAI, I think it's a good place to start with what do we even call AI? What does artificial intelligence mean to you?
A highly, well, somebody once said to me, what is artificial intelligence? Bad choice of words in the 1950s. So I think some of these, some of these decisions people made a long time ago come back to haunt us. Um, I mean, I find it a really interesting term because it's a term that's been a part of my life for years because as a field, as you well know, it is 60 something years old in the UK, Edinburgh being one of the first centres of expertise beyond the kind of three big ones, MIT and Stanford and Carnegie Mellon in the US. So I've always been aware that it has this very long history as a research field. Just from my time working at the University of Edinburgh those years ago. But now, now I think the term, and this is some of the danger I see, that the term AI is at once a shortcut for a product class. So people will say AI and they mean ChatGPT. And it's also a shortcut for a type of AI. They will say AI and they mean generative AI. And so I think this is, and I've seen this before in other fields. I saw this in the kind of learning analytics field when a field of research was condensed down in people's minds to a product and a particular type of learning analytics application, kind of predictive risk factors and that kind of stuff. And partly I think that's driven by when something becomes a product that people can put their hands on and see and touch, when a layperson can put their hands on it and see it and touch, that becomes the avatar for that thing in their mind. So right now, I think AI means a very narrow set of AI and one or two, maybe three big products that they can put their hands on and touch and see. But for me personally, it's a massive field of endeavor that's decades old.
All right, all right. So that's going to be certainly a broad notion of AI. There is a definition I got from 2019 by Wang et al., who were saying AI is an information processing system able to adapt to its environment while operating with insufficient knowledge and resources. What do you think of that one?
I mean, it's a broad description. I think I probably don't feel I have enough knowledge of AI as a field, as a technical field, to say whether that's complete as a definition for all the different flavors of AI, because I think what the majority of us have ever seen is forms of AI based on neural networks. And there is, of course, another, albeit smaller, sort of strand of AI work that's not in that space. And I just don't know enough to say how complete a definition it is. But as a definition of the things I have personally put my hands on and played with, it's pretty good, I would say.
Okay, cool. So that will give us a little bit of grounding of what we're talking about. And then on the other hand, you mentioned that you worked in the field of open education for quite a while now. What does open mean to you in that context?
Oh my God.
I'm
You're
opening
asking
a
about
can of
all the
worms here.
contested terms, all the contest, and then we're going to put the two things together and it's all going to explode. I mean, I think that is, we almost joke at conversations every time we try to define what open education means, and that I think there's a lovely image of a tree with like all the different kinds of open in sort of bubbles in its branches, and that's one that myself and other colleagues have used quite regularly to say, it's a really broad umbrella. For me personally, open is a means to an end, though. Um, so I care about education and I work in education because I think education is how we build better, fairer, more equal, and more just societies. It's how we lift all of us up. It's how we encourage economic participation. It's how we better ourselves on a number of different societal measures. So that's my fundamental belief in education. And so then I believe that certain things are important to achieve that. Certain ways in which you approach education are important to achieve that. So thinking about the extent to which you embed social justice principles in the education system, thinking about the extent to which you support students to have some agency in their education system, in their education, the ways in which you support staff to academics to have agency in their education, in their participation in the education system. And so it can mean open science, it can mean using open technologies, it can mean using open pedagogies. These are, for me, all tools that we have that we can use to realize this bigger project of socially just and agentic education that lifts people out of wherever they are and lifts us all up together. So that's a bit of a waffly answer, but it's very broad. It does lead me to questions like, can you have, um, can you claim to be doing open education, as it were, if you are asking students to use extractive technologies that do kind of nasty things with their data, for example, or are built on unjust labor practices. Like, it poses all sorts of conundrums like that. Equally, open, and this is why I think it's important to say it's a tool in pursuit of that bigger aim. It is not the principle in and of itself, because there are also scenarios in which people's agency is taken away by open, because a lot of our understanding, particularly in the intellectual property area, so when we think about open data and we think about open source software, for example, which are built on copyright law is built on Western ideas of ownership. And so when you move into communities that don't share those same perspectives, particularly thinking about Indigenous data, or other marginalized communities' data, it can do harm. So I'm always wary to say, like, open is one of the tools through which we can pursue that bigger aim, but open in and of itself can't be, the only way to get there, because for some people it won't be.
Mhm. So open is inextricably linked to social justice, and it encompasses open education practices. You mentioned intellectual property, um, and I guess in these approaches, what define something as not open? Because you've mentioned that um, there are situations when you might be an open educator, but using extractive tools that harm the people using them. So that's not true openness. So is something that is socially just across a wide variety of dimensions openness?
That that's why I shy away from saying from conflating open with the principle. I think open approaches are tools that you can use to achieve socially just outcomes. Open in and of itself, I don't think you can say is always socially just.
Mm, mm,
I think it breaks down for certain people in certain contexts. Equally, I think that there are occasions where you don't have any choice but to use some of the tools that are provided in institutions. I've done a lot of work implementing commercial ed tech in institutions, but I think that how you approach those as open educators, you can approach them transparently. You can explain what's going on. You can try and give as much choice as you can, but at a certain point, there may not be choice that you can give. But you can be transparent still about what you're doing, and you can achieve the best outcome under the circumstances. And I think at that point, I wouldn't want to say you weren't following um, you weren't behaving openly, I
mm.
suppose. So I think it's not. I always shy away from kind of binary definitions, and I really dislike the open closed because, and we probably will come on to this in some of the conversation with open source AI. I just don't think the world is that straightforward, and I just don't think that binary definitions are that helpful. They back us into corners sometimes. I think there's a constant process of negotiation that goes on with open. It's a spectrum, and how open can you be is really contextual. Um, but if you've got that principle in mind always, and this is why I separate the principle and the tool to get there, or the strategies for getting there, then I think you can find the right balance. So
Mhm.
sometimes open strategies, be they technology, OER, practices, whatever, they'll be the right way to get there. Other times they won't.
All right. So open really then encompasses a wide range of tools. I see how it's not necessarily the important thing in the conversation, but for the sake of argument, in and of itself, openness now can be, we've discussed in the context of OER, of open educational practices, of open source, and you also mentioned transparency as a theme. So, is there something that connects here the different things about openness, or does it just have many different meanings that are all open?
Oh my goodness, these are the big philosophical questions in the open space. I mean, I, I like to think that we are. Okay, I think the thing that for me it is the thread that runs through all this is agency. It's having some sense of sovereignty, some sense of self-determination, some sense of choice, some ability to shape the world in ways that are appropriate and relevant. Um, so, open source software is the ability to build or modify software for your particular needs. You have and the ability to, it's a transparency element, but this is why I do a lot of work in open source in education, because I think that software dictates, for example, how we can teach. It's not a neutral tool. Once you start using software for teaching, it has some influence in what you can do. It constrains and enables. So I think it's really important that as teachers we have agency over that, because I think that it's our teaching at a certain point, and the two are really enmeshed. When I think about OER, I think it's really important that they can be locally adapted for context, so that you can see yourself in them. If we want to break down Western dominance of knowledge domains, I think OERs are really, it's one of the strategies for doing that. So I think that's agency and self-determination and self-sovereignty piece, without going too far into libertarianism and everybody is a sovereign individual and all of that. But that's for me, it comes back to that bigger purpose. Like a healthy society is a society in which people can participate.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And then,
Big question.
like, it only gets better. So, like you foresaw already, now when we connect the world of AI, the entirety of artificial intelligence,
Oh,
with the ideas of openness, in the
yeah.
sense of approaches that enable people to take autonomy and in a self-determined way act on their own behalf. What would openness mean in the context of AI in education?
In education is, I mean, I come back to that point about you can you can go way down the path of open educational practices with closed source tools, because you can you can inspect them and you can explain them and you can use them as ways of interrogating the world around you, and you can still achieve some of your educational objectives and outcomes. So an example of that might be, instead of just sort of scolding students and saying don't use ChatGPT to cheat, actually um, it, critically examining these tools and understanding that they are cultural, societal, political, and economic artifacts, and looking at how that manifests and what that means. We know there are certain biases in them. You ask it to produce you a picture of a teacher in the front of a classroom, and it's mostly going to produce you a man at the front of the classroom, for example, unless it's a grade school teacher, younger years teacher. But you want a university professor, you're probably going to get a dude. So you can play with things like that. And that's a really simple example. There are many, 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 many more things you can do with these tools. Um, but but they are limited. So I think at a certain point, and this is maybe where my artifact comes in, we do need to say, in the same way as we understand what open source software is, we do need to say what is open source AI, and we do need to have a definition for that. And it's actually pretty important that we have a definition for that, because that term is now in legislation. We are starting to see the regulation of the software industry as a whole, but the regulation of the AI space with the EU AI Act, and open source is named in that. So without a definition of what open source is, there's territory there to for and there's vested interests in that territory, as you might imagine, because there's billions of dollars in this generative AI space in this moment right now. So I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, I would love to see an education system where we could actually have some agency and use these tools, use these technologies, not necessarily the commercial tools that are out there today, but build a generative AI commons of our own that is tailored to some of our own specific needs and specific values. I have done a little bit of playing around, remixing OER, for example, and taking a textbook and creating summaries for different age groups, different contexts, and there's value in that for sure. There's value in that. I asked one of these tools to create me an explanation of cell walls, but to do it in a kind of like gritty. It's actually a platform that does is designed to do genre writing, so romance fiction, fantasy, all that kind of stuff. And I asked it to do me like a kind of gritty description of a give no Fs, and it was really funny. And I thought if I was actually trying to explain this to possibly not with the F bombs it put in there, but if I was trying to explain what cell walls were to a group of kids in a way that might be interesting. Like, but some of the descriptions in there were pretty good, and I'm not inventive enough to come up with that. So anyway, that's it. I think there is application in there, and I'd like us to think really critically about what a generative AI commons owned and operated and shared within um, the academy might look like, rather than
That's a really,
constantly just taking. Anyway, sorry, go
yeah,
on.
that's a really interesting use case. And so I'm picking up on a few kind of parallel themes. You mentioned about openness in the sense of how people use AI, how an educator might use open education practices. And then this isn't about the tool, this is about how it's being used. Then there's open source AI, and that's about the AI model itself. And then you mentioned the commons, so that's about the AI outputs, which isn't really about the tool, but what comes out of it.
Oh no, I'm arguing
Mhm.
for a commons of AI tools.
Ah, okay, okay. What
I'm
do you mean
arguing
by
for, I
that?
mean, commons of outputs as well, but commons of tools as well. So, um, I think this is one of the spaces where actually the line between output and tool, generative AI is where the line between output and tool is very blurry for me. So there is definite utility in having a really simple file format like a PDF of a, say, a biology textbook, a PDF of a biology textbook, because that's a really easy, low bandwidth thing to distribute. That's a thing that can be printed in physical form. And we think about all of the kinds of scenarios in which we might want to distribute that knowledge, the simplest file format, and sometimes that piece of paper is still a really useful tool to have. However, the ability to and commercial textbook publishers are doing this today. You can go to Pearson and have a look at some of their examples of this already. But I think with generative AI now, the sense in which that textbook could be a system, it like that line is very blurry. You could have a textbook that you could ask questions of. So here's my basic biology textbook, and it's the source, it's the data in a generative AI application, and I can say, I don't get this bit. Please explain it to me again. Reword this for me. Make this simpler for me. Generate me a few test questions on this to check I understand it. Get me additional information about this. Get me remedial information because I don't get this because I don't understand some other concept that's not in the book. So can you get me the bit I don't understand so that I can understand this bit? So it becomes an interactive textbook in a really interesting sort of a way. Now there are problems, and it's my nerdy head says that's super exciting, and then the other half of me says, but for all the people that don't have bandwidth, don't have computers, it's an interesting space and place to play in. But that's why I still come back to, there's always a place for the kind of traditional OER, if I can put it that way. And I hate that phrase because I think it sets up a binary between new OER and old OER, which I don't like because it sets up a have and have not dynamic. So I think maybe static OER and dynamic OER might be a better way without a value judgment of old and new being put on it. They're just different things. But I think that opportunity to have kind of that dynamic and interactive OER, beyond an animation or the kinds of H5P things we've maybe created today. That's super interesting to me. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and I can
I'm
see how
waffling
here the
again.
line between model and output really is blurred. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But on this line, can you think of any examples of AI technologies that you would call OpenAI?
Now, here is where I'm duty bound to say, no, I cannot, because there is no definition of what open source AI means today. Therefore, there is nothing to test them against.
Very
And
well.
because one of the organizations I work with are working on that definition, because it is contested right now. There are different people who want that territory for themselves. Some of them with good intent, and some of them with, well, it is a term in legislation with some specific carve-outs in legislation. So there are some benefits for some people in influencing what that definition means, because it will have economic implications for them. So I will say today, no, there is no, but there are things that are very close. And I think once that definition is available, there will be absolutely things we can point to, because it isn't a definition that's being crafted in isolation. People are looking at existing models alongside and saying, would this be? Would it fit? Would it not fit? It's not to say it's being tailored to fit certain models, not at all, but it's being validated and checked. Is this actually practically workable in the real world?
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I suppose this definitely presupposes that the open label is force for good, and it's something desirable that people want.
It does, and I think that without going down too much of a rabbit hole, AI is the space where open content and open code hit each other, because open source software is relatively simple by comparison to an AI system, and you have so many types of artifacts in an AI system. um, so what's the basic number of artifacts that have to be there to have a complete system is one question. And then what are all of those things is the next question. And then what licensing regimes apply to all of those things? And I mean, it's super interesting if you like this sort of thing. The code is easy because, excuse me, we know what open source software is today. We know how to apply an open source license to code, done. So your training code, your algorithms, all of that stuff, easy. Stick an open source license on it, it's open, we know what that means. Model weights are the output of a training process. They're machine generated. They have the same problem as OERs generated by a Gen AI engine, that copyright law doesn't accommodate non-human authors. So they're in this same grey, mushy copyright space, that they're machine generated. So can you assert copyright on them? So it becomes, you can't easily apply an open source license to them because that's built on copyright law. So it falls down at that point. So, but you can say these are openly licensed. You can use things like CC0, for example. You can create statements about how open they are. So there's some ways around that. And then there's the data piece, which is not something we've always had to contend with. And that's where a lot of the conversation right now is in that definition piece. How much data needs to be available for a system to be open? And it's based on the idea that there are four freedoms: the freedom to use, to study, to modify, and to share. What's the minimum amount of stuff you need to achieve those four freedoms? Gone down a big rabbit hole. This has been my world for, for a while, or
That's
part of my world
perfect.
at least. But it really creates all sorts of interesting conversations, and it comes back to what I said at the beginning about negotiating, and this constant process of negotiation in imperfection. Because a scenario I have in my head, one of my kind of litmus tests in this space. We know that there is an immense potential in language learning with a lot of these tools. We're seeing a number. I mean, Duolingo's been around for years in this space. We're seeing more and more potential here. We're seeing communities develop their own for marginalized languages. We're seeing those communities developing their own tools and their own technologies based on pre-trained foundational models. And we know that those communities have views around intellectual property and data sovereignty that don't align with Western thinking. The extent to which Maori people will consider, data to be held. They don't consider themselves owners. They would be stewards of the data, and it's held in common by a community. And so that really clashes with a lot of the concepts on which copyright and data ownership in a kind of Western mindset are constructed. So would you ever be able to share that data openly, the data that these language learning tools have been trained on? Would you ever be able to share that openly? No, because you'd be violating Indigenous data sovereignty by forcing them to do that, and they just won't because it's important. And so at that point, you're saying, well, you can't be open then, so you can't participate in this bigger community, but bluntly, this bigger economic practice, because open source software today is about 70 to 90% of what's in commercial software. It's what the world software industry runs on. So you start slicing whole populations out of the potential for economic participation there. They can take some stuff, but once they've built their own thing, they can't ever share it on openly. So nah, I get really uncomfortable about some of that stuff. And that's the negotiated space. That's where it open, we mustn't overload it with too many values because at a certain point it's not doing good, it's doing harm or can do harm because it's not a good fit for everything. Um,
Right.
and
So
then
when you
anyway,
mentioned openness being a spectrum, it's sort of like open in different ways, but it's actually with different meanings of openness. It might not be even possible to have something truly open that's open in all senses because some of them are just incompatible.
yeah, and I mean a part of me will say open as a spectrum. I know I said it earlier, but like I think open education is a spectrum of different practices. Um, I think that if I think about the open source software world, it's a binary. It's open or it's not open. It's very clear because it's a very clear definition. I think, the wooliness is maybe in the practices space. But in some spaces where there are definitions, so there's an open data definition, there's an open source definition that, you can say that's open or that's closed because it does or doesn't meet the definition. How you craft the definition and where you put the bar for that binary, yes, no, that's a negotiation as well. OER, for example, if it's licensed using an open content license, typically CC licenses or something's in the public domain. Again, we've got a very clear definition there. Yeah.
Mhm. So linking back to our, I guess, previous sort of summary, there's openness in what an open tool means, and that can be a clear, defined boundary, although where the boundaries is negotiated. Whereas on how the tools are being used, that can have many more meanings and isn't necessarily a clear binary answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why when you say, what is open education, my brain kind of explodes because it isn't just one thing. I mean, it can mean, for some people, it does mean one thing. For some people, it means OER. and it means openly licensed textbooks and saving students money with openly licensed textbooks. And that's a good thing. Very happy with all of that. I just think there's more. There's more. It's a bigger toolkit than just that. But that's still a very good thing to do. And I wouldn't say that's not open education. I'd just say there's more in there and we can do some slightly more interesting things than that. But yeah.
Sounds good. I'm also aware of the time as it's really like coming to the end of
I've
our
talked too
scheduled
much.
slot.
I'm sorry.
Oh, good. I'm happy to hear what you have to say because it's all really interesting. Um, I'm still free, but I don't want to keep you any longer
No,
than
no, I'm fine. I can
okay,
keep going. Yeah, I still got
sure.
coffee, so we're good.
Sounds good. But if you have to go, just let me know. So, for the next question, I wanted to ask you, how do you perceive the role of OpenAI in enhancing education? Talking about potential benefits here.
Um, I don't think OpenAI enhances education. I think educators enhance education, and OpenAI may be one of the tools we use to do that. So to I think it's always dangerous to embed the principle in the technology. I think that's a problematic way of looking at the world, which leads us down to some bad decisions because you can use a tool for. They're not neutral. They are cultural and social artifacts. You have to understand that they're a product of culture. They have values baked into them. So they have ideas of what education is baked into them, and and those can be good or bad. Equally, you can use them for good or bad ends. So I was looking last night at some of these tools that will auto-generate your course for you. There's some that are built into LMSs and some you can buy as plugins for LMSs. And the one I was looking at last night basically was like save time on your tedious course building. And I'm like, I like building courses because I care about my students. Like that offends the core of my values as an educator. That I mean, the tedious bit of building a course is working in the LMS. It's not the thinking about my course materials and the content. So there's a value judgment baked into that tool from the very start about what it's for. It's to save people time on building out course material to do something else, which I mean, there are plenty of things to be doing in universities, and we have too much work and not enough time. But I'm not sure what else it thinks we are doing if we're not teaching and caring about our teaching, and the idea that teaching is stuff, that teaching is content. It's about shoveling content at students, and the putting that together is a tedious part of our job. Like that's a deeply, deeply problematic worldview in my as an open educator who's thinking about liberatory pedagogies. That's just so so that's where some of my we mustn't overload the technology with the principle. We as educators come to it with a set of values, we come to it with a context, we come to it with a purpose. And then it will or it won't be the right thing to use to achieve our aims. Context is super important. Some of the work I do here in BC with the government on the Digital Learning Advisory Committee, yeah, we heard pretty strongly that for some populations in the province, the cost of a device is prohibitive. You can have all the great ed tech in a university you want at that point. If the student hasn't got a device to connect, doesn't matter. So, so that I come back to the OER example again. Context is super, super important. It will be a cool thing and a useful thing to use sometimes, and other times it won't.
Yeah. So thinking about these examples, kind of linking back to our earlier bit of a conversation, that openness is the principle of enabling people's autonomy and self-determination. And so as a tool, you're saying open could be used in a way, open tools could be used in a way that does help that, but not necessarily. It really depends more on how they're being used.
100%. So to use that kind of interactive textbook example that I gave, if you don't know the context of your students, if you don't know their internet connectivity, if you don't know what kind of devices they have, if you make that your standard textbook for the class, you may actually exclude students from teaching. So you either have to think about that as a design issue and have an alternative, and um, that will be a good thing to do anyway. They're equally, that kind of approach could be really advantageous for people with certain kinds of disabilities. It's another interface, another way of interfacing with content that could be more accessible for some learners. So it's a real, it comes back to context. It comes back to understanding who your students are, what they need, and what the right way to go about it is. It could be highly liberatory and widen access, or it could narrow access. And it could do
Mhm.
both of those things for one class of students because they're not all the same. So really thinking about the design of your learning and teaching, which is why I come back to that dreadful AI example of let us barf out your content for you in an unthinking way to take the tedium away from you. No, it's a super important thing that we should be spending our time thinking about.
Mhm. And thinking about how we use AI and how it will impact people in the future, on the technology itself and open use of technology, are there any emerging trends or developments that you believe will shape or influence the future of openness in AI?
Hmm, really good question. I mean, I think it's a so Gen AI, I think, is super, super interesting. It's fascinating to be able to touch it and play with it in a way that's highly accessible. That's not something we've ever really had as a society before, and it's opened up a different level of conversation, and it's opened up a different level of conversation beyond the technical, because it's opened up these questions of bias, it's opened up these questions of ownership, of intellectual property, of kind of commodification of knowledge. There's all sorts of interesting uh, debates and conversations around it. What is it to be an artist in this moment in time? What is the value of art? These are some of the conversations that have appeared. So to that extent, I think the the ways in which it's a mirror for some things about our society as a whole is really interesting to me. However, I also think we're at the peak of a hype cycle, and it's incredibly eye-wateringly expensive for maybe not as good an output as we need it to have. So I have used it for, summaries of transcripts, for example, in the past. And it's good, but it's not that good. It smooths stuff out. And we're seeing various trials of people using these technologies, and it's good, but it's not quite as good as a human. And I certainly know in my teaching context, if you give me an essay that you've had an AI write for you, like it's a mediocre essay most times because it's sort of Dave Cormier uses this analogy of auto tuning. it sort of smooths things out. It loses an amount of specificity. It loses, once you've read a lot of AI generated content, you can sort of, there's a flavor and a texture to it, and it's very bland and meh. So I think we're, I think it will continue to force us to have these really interesting conversations about society. But I also think it's going to pop as a bubble, and it's going to get a bit bleak before it shakes out into what it's really going to be.
Hmm. So that's, I guess, very much like the Gartner cycle of
It's the hype
innovations. Like,
cycle. We
yeah.
are plummeting down into the trough of despair right now. But I think the amount of money that's been poured into it and the extent to which companies are or aren't are prepared to buy subscriptions for these, some of the tools that are baked into, say, productivity suites, because they're not quite good enough and the cost is quite high for the quality of the product. Um, it's going to take a while to shake out. I really do think, I'm not saying there's no place for this stuff. I really do think there is a place for this stuff, but um, it's not what we see today,
Hmm.
or not the majority of what we see today.
Right. And going forward, I know that there is a lot of effort going into uh, promoting, um, I guess, openness. And one way of that is defining what open source AI means. But thinking about it from the broad perspective of all the different values that open represents, what steps do you think are necessary to promote openness in AI in education?
I guess the question I would have is like, why? Why do we need to? Like, what is it we're trying to do? Um, because open AI, I mean, beyond having a definition so that we can point to it clearly and say what it is and what it isn't, like what it always comes back to, what is it we're trying to do? Open is not the principle in and of itself. Open is the strategy for one of the strategies for achieving the principle. So I think open will find its OpenAI will find its place as we negotiate our way through where it's a fit and where it's not, where it's useful to us and where it's harmful, where it's the cost benefit doesn't stack up. Um, I don't have a feeling about whether we should, well, I think we should have agency over the things we use, and if the things we use are AI things, I think we should have some ownership and some agency and ability to work together and to share those things. And to that extent, that's where I think the open licensing stuff and the definition stuff is really important. But it always comes back to the purpose, and open isn't the principle.
Yeah,
Open's the
so
tool.
like with the education parallel, you mentioned perhaps social justice is the goal and open education is the way to get there, but what we want to promote is social justice and then say,
Yeah,
okay, maybe open education is
yeah.
the way to achieve it.
So
So,
OpenAI will be an OpenAI application of
right.
some description, an OpenAI system of some description will be the right way to get somewhere in some contexts for some purposes. But in and of itself, it's not good or bad. Well, that's not true. There's some really bad. There's a pretty horrible actually, but yeah, it's it's back to, the technology isn't imbued with the principle. It's a cultural artifact. It carries a whole bunch of values. It's a social artifact and an economic and a political artifact.
Right. So perhaps a correct uses and Well, correct. Uses that promote certain values that people might aspire to will become more and more apparent over time as we go down the hype trough and back up.
And this is why I really do feel we have to be in this space and play. There's a number of people who are, I hear a number of people say this stuff has no place. And I think, no, actually, isn't it? Like part of agency is negotiating your way through change and through this inflection point. Something's changed, the disruption has happened. It happened to us, but because this stuff just appeared and ate our brains. But it's now our job as an academy to play with it and to understand it and to work out what it is for us. Because if we don't, somebody else will tell us, and they already are. Come and use my tool to remove the tedium of building your coursework, or come and use this, or do that, or save money here, or save time here, or we will, and that's the agency bit again. If I can't underplay both the potential and the constraints that exist in technology. If we are in the driving seat and have agency, there is all sorts of possibility. But if it is done to us, then that closes off all sorts of possibilities. I mean, this is again why I play in the open source space, because if technologies are cultural and social artifacts, I want our values baked into them, rightly or
Mhm.
wrongly. And my values are not somebody else's. So, there's all of that too. What is good for me will not be good for somebody else as well. But yeah, no, I'm being quite waffly, I think. So clip out what you need to clip out.
It's really interesting, and we've covered a wide range of different meanings of open and what it could be used for and what it might end up being used for. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
You're welcome. And there's
As we
nothing
wrap up,
there, I think, actually, that I'm worried about sharing. So go for it.
okay, sounds good. So as we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add or discuss about the use or future of open AI technologies in education that we haven't covered?
Yes, but you're not going to be able to share it. So if you want to know where the real power of some of this stuff is and where it might be going and where the potential is, go and look at the gaming industry, the porn industry, and the romance writing industry. And we are, I think, very myopic uh, as educators, and we're looking at our own narrow slice of the world, and we're looking at where do these tools fit. Um, we talk about potential for personalized learning with AI. Go and look at the Gen AI literotica space, and you will see personalized learning. You'll see it working right now. There is girlfriend GPT, and it's creepy as hell. But if you want to tailor your, like, that's your tailored personal tutor. Like, it's there's a moral spectrum there, and a kind of that, like, we won't go and look in those places because they're a bit grubby and dirty, and people are doing some slightly awkward things there, and we can't write a peer-reviewed paper about that. But actually, some of the things we are interested in are happening right now over there. And you can see the possibilities and the limitations of the technology right there. If you're prepared to look past your moral judgments about what's going on there, if you want to see ways in which creatives are working with technology, go and look at genre fiction, and go and look at some of the platforms that enable genre fiction writing. We're having this moral panic about the loss of our creative and thinking faculties. but I'm looking at genre fiction writing platforms that require an understanding of what it is to write a novel to get started, but then allow you to use AI in a number of different ways for drafting, for spitballing and workshopping with, in all sorts of interesting ways. And that's, it's a real cyborg metaphor in there that's interesting to me. And that's the interesting space. But in education right now, we're far too worried about, I don't know, plagiarism at scale of our content, which was is a good thing to be worried about. I'm not, or students cheating, or there's more interesting places to be looking. I don't know what of that you could use.
What you mentioned earlier really links in that AI is a mirror of society, and it's what we look at the edges that we see some interesting reflections back.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I mean, it's a really creative space, and it always has been with many other technologies as well. I mean, even just the internet. These are domains where we saw pushes in the technology, um, and some of it kind of flows back eventually in other ways. But go and look at the edges. Go and look at communities who are not like the communities that you are in, and have a look at what they're doing.
Sounds good. All right. I'm going to stop the recording there. Thank you so much once
You're
again. It's been
welcome.
a great chat. I really enjoyed that.
It's been useful for me to kind of try and think it through in my own head as well. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm sorry if I was a bit too philosophical at points, but
Not at all. It's exactly what we were looking for.
so